Welcome. My name is Jim DeWald. I'm the Dean of the Haskayne School of Business, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the 5th Annual PETRONAS International Energy Speakers Series. Today, we are speaking about security and climate. What is Canada's role? So thank you for joining us. We're so delighted to be back in person again, and what a wonderful crowd we've got here. But before we proceed, I have some important acknowledgements to make. Firstly, our territorial acknowledgement. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, the Piikani, Nagainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. As you probably know, the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now that's sort of the scripted version of the acknowledgement. When I think about the topic today, energy, climate, and security, and think about our history on this land, I can't help but recognize that the Treaty 7 that I referred to was signed in 1877, which is 145 years ago. And if you do the math, that's 7 generations. And if you know about Indigenous perspectives and views, 7 generations is very important. And when you do things going forward, your goal is to try and set things up so that it's better 7 generations in the future. So I find it really an interesting balance to think about the last 7 generations. And in fact, I think it's important for us to all be mindful that there's actually 500 generations of Indigenous people on this land before that, dealing with many of the security and energy issues, albeit at a different scale that we face today. But before we get into the topic, we have some housekeeping. And number 1, covering off safety procedures. If the fire alarm rings, please remain calm and listen to the instructions given over the intercom or by staff. If you are prompted to evacuate, follow the marked exits, which you can see on the side here. Do not use the elevator in an emergency. And one other housekeeping item is the washrooms. Many of you have been to events in this location, beautiful facility. The washrooms are a mile away. So if you have to go, it's out this door, down the escalator or the stairs, and out near where you drove your car to or where you came in, but there is a large washroom there, and just take a bun with you and you'll be fine. Now, we do want to keep our lunch on schedule, so your food arrives. Please do enjoy right away as things come, and we're just going to keep rolling right through the lunch. Now, this series brings amazing speakers to share energy insights from a global perspective. It really started with the idea, and I remember meeting with Mike Timms and Mike Culbert about we have tendency to be maybe a little inward focused when we talk about energy policy in Alberta. And what if we brought people from other parts of the world to talk about how Canada is perceived from their perspective? Last year, we had a really fascinating, because had to do it online, but we have a live simulcast from Europe to Asia of Marie van de Hoven, former executive director of the International Energy Agency, Tengku Taufik, the CEO of PETRONAS Global, and the Honorable Seamus O'Regan, former Minister of Natural Resources, all in one session together. Now, I would like to extend a big thank you to PETRONAS Canada for establishing this speaker series that allows us to bring these perspectives on what is happening globally. This is the 5th year, as I think I mentioned, and in the first year we gained a political perspective. The second year we focused on financial markets, and the third year we explored LNG, and last year the focus was on Canada's path to 2050. So There will be time, by the way, there will be time for audience questions at the end of today's event. But to get us rolling with our main speaker, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Iswan Ismail, President and CEO of PETRONAS Canada, to share a few words. Iswan?
Thanks, Dean DeWalt, and welcome everyone to the PETRONAS International Energy Speaker Series. This is actually the 5th year we've had the pleasure of supporting the event, bringing together distinguished and world-renowned speakers and dignitaries as well. PETRONAS, as a global energy group and a Fortune Global 500 company with presence in over 50 countries, we are always interested to hear Canada's perspective on Canada's role in the global energy transition, and also Canada's role in addressing the global challenges of energy security, climate, and affordability. And this year's topic is, of course, top of mind to many in the globe, and I think to many of us in the audience as well, as we watch the humanitarian tragedy and energy crisis unfold in Europe. It is a cause, I think, for thoughtful pause. And I think it's a pause for reconsideration of the global energy needs. And really a time to reflect on the importance of a deliberate and measured climate policy implementation as the world undergoes an energy transition. The conversation around energy is often polarized between security over climate, security or climate, but I prefer to look at the issues as security and climate. In fact, I'm certain that the two can and should be achieved together. And I also believe that PETRONAS is taking the right steps both on the global scale and here in Canada. PETRONAS recognizes the opportunity Canada has to be a leading exporter of low-carbon energy products and sees the important role Canada could and should play in supporting energy security in Asia, Europe, and around the world as well. As a testament to that vision, PETRONAS have a growth plan that will responsibly produce natural gas and LNG for decades to come, and we continue to look for opportunities here in Canada. It was encouraging to me to hear Minister Wilkinson, Canada's Federal Minister of Natural Resources, last week in Calgary, acknowledge the role Canadian LNG, specifically LNG Canada, can have in assisting Canada's European friends through providing enhanced supply of LNG to the global energy market, which will offset production from less friendly and lower ESG performing nations around the world. Because we believe that it is possible for Canada to remain globally competitive while staying true to its climate ambitions. This will require the right policy, signals, strong collaboration between industry and government, and a streamlined regulatory process to ensure our continued excellence in sustainable resource development while seizing on the opportunities that are ahead of us. As the world is seeing the consequences of policy getting ahead of the realities of existing energy infrastructure and demand, we have much to learn from what is occurring in Europe. And I think we certainly have much to learn from the insights of our speaker today, Mr. Peter Altmaier. Mr. Altmaier studied law in Saarland University in Saarbrücken. In 1990, he became official of the European Commission, and from 1993 to 94, he was Secretary General for the Administrative Commission on Social Security for Migrant Workers. In the years that followed, he was Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of the Interior. Due to his commitment and expertise, Peter earned great respect from Chancellor Angela Merkel and was considered a close confidant. From May 2012 to December 2013, Peter Altmaier was Federal Minister for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety, his central area of responsibility being the implementation of the energy transition. And in October 2017, Peter assumed the office of Federal Minister of Finance, and from March 2018 to 21, he held the office of Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy. Back in 2004, Peter was made a Knight of the French Legion of Honor, and in 2006, he became President of the Europa Union Deutschland, of which he has been Honorary President since 2011. So Mr. Altmaier's experience offers unique and exceptional insight into geopolitics as we work to address the global issues of climate change and energy security together. Please join me to welcome Mr. Peter Altmaier to the stage.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, Mr. Dean, dear CEO of PETRONAS University of Calgary, Haskayne School of Business, and you all from this wonderful province and city of Alberta and Calgary. It is such an enormous pleasure of joining you today and to exchange some thoughts about one of the biggest challenges in modern times. And incidentally, I made a telephone call this night with my former Chancellor, Angela Merkel. I was in her team for more than 20 years, and from time to time we are doing telephone calls still or meeting each other. And then I told her I'm in Canada, in Calgary, will deliver a speech tomorrow. And she said, "Oh, wonderful. Canada is one of the most impressive countries I've ever seen," and this is one reason, there's one reason for that, and I can confirm it by my own experience with at least 4 different Canadian ambassadors in Germany and many, many ministerial colleagues over time. Canada, in international relationships, has never been a problem, but always been part of a solution. And that is something that has helped us and has helped you, because the Canadian economy was developing and flourishing over decades, as the German economy was doing as well. And we all felt, in Calgary as well as in Berlin or in Saarbrücken, where I come from, we all felt that we are living in one world. And that means we have to find solutions together with others, and we have to find solutions that work. And in the 20 years I was allowed to assist and to support Angela Merkel, I realized that the energy issue climbed higher and higher on the political agenda than ever before in modern history. I cannot remember from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s a similar importance of debate. And energy has climbed higher on the agenda for 2 reasons. One is, when the Cold War found his, what we thought end, but was just a pause, as we know now better. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact was disentangled, then, ladies and gentlemen, many countries around the globe adopted principles of market economy, what we did already hundreds of years before. And this has led to an unprecedented economic growth. Look at China. Look at the Asian countries, at Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and many, many others. Global growth has been fueled and increased in an unprecedented way. And that resulted in an ever higher and ever more growing energy demand. And at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we have discovered in the 90s at a political level the issue of climate change. Yes, I know there are many, many people involved in the business of energy and providing secure energy supply for millions and billions of people around the globe. And I am, as a former politician, extremely grateful for that. But I say also as a former politician that for me, there is no doubt that climate change is underway. And climate change is influenced by human beings and human activities. Nobody can give you exact figures and exact percentages. But one thing is sure, your children and your grandchildren and the children of your grandchildren will ask our generation what we have done to avoid or to mitigate climate change. And therefore, I always felt the responsibility of bringing two worlds together. The world of energy production, distribution, and supply, that is so important for our economies and our well-being, and the world of the necessary steps to better protect climate, and that means to reduce CO2 emissions coming from fossil fuels. It resulted in the Paris Climate Agreement. This agreement was signed years ago. It was ratified by all our parliaments. About 200 countries have signed to the agreement, and we are now in the middle of a very important but also painful and delicate debate on how to implement and what to do to achieve the goal of affordability, of security and safety of energy supply, and of climate protection in parallel and all together. And in Germany, I can tell you, we have been frontrunners for many, many years. When I was appointed Minister for Renewable Energies and Environment in 2012, Germany had a percentage of 21% of renewable energies in the electricity supply. When I left office as a Minister of the Economy and Energy last year in December, this has more than doubled to 46%. I do not know any other industrialized country in a similar way, densely populated like Germany, with a higher share of renewables in the electricity production than we have. But ladies and gentlemen, I've always been honest to my people, to everybody in my country, and to be honest means that we have to acknowledge that no single country, not Germany, not Canada, and no other country in the world I know, is be able to provide 100% of its energy demand by renewable energies alone. And this has very simple reasons. Renewable energies are volatile. They are not always providing electricity when it is needed. They are producing more electricity in summer, as an average, than in winter. But in winter, the demand of the private sector, of the economy, and of the private people is higher than in summer. And so, ladies and gentlemen, this has become a very controversial issue, and we have to find solutions that are affordable and that do work in practice. And this is as the more important, as we are all facing disruptive evolutions of an unprecedented scale. When my airplane of Air Canada, wonderful carrier, approached Calgary airport, I could see a landscape, and my impression was it has not changed in 200 years. When I'm in Italy, in Rome, and I see the ruins of the Roman Empire, I think there is a culture that has not changed so much over 2,000 years. But when you look at what is going on around the globe with regard to disruptive innovations, then you see it is faster and it's more frequent than ever before. I give you 3 examples. 1, technological disruption by digitization, by biotechnologies, and by many other innovations. If you think Europe is a frontrunner, the US is always a frontrunner, Canada is a frontrunner, then I say you are wrong. When I was elected member of parliament in 1994 for the first time, China was an exporter of some raw materials and some rather simple gadgets for small toys, for small children, and similar things. Today, China is a leading world technology exporter. Many new technologies are developed in China. So US have taken the lead with regard to biotechnology and in some areas of digitization. Europe and Germany, in some respect, are lagging behind. Will we catch up? Because whenever there was a disruptive evolution, when the sail ships, big technological advanced things were replaced by the steamers 200 years ago, lots of jobs in the coastal areas disappeared, but more jobs emerged in the same areas. And now for the first time in modern history, there is a risk that the old jobs would disappear in Europe or in Canada or somewhere else, and the new jobs would emerge in China, in Indonesia, or elsewhere. That is something we should have in mind. The political disruption. When I have spent a lot of time in Asia because I love the people, I love their spirit, I love their optimism with regard to technological progress. But when we know that everybody on this planet has the right of the pursuit of happiness, we can imagine what it means if all these people in Asia will do it successfully. And it is their right. It is not a favor that we are granting. And when you see there are living millions and billions of people, most of the people are now living in Asia. Very few, relatively few compared to that in Africa or in Europe. And in Canada, it is not so densely populated as the Shanghai area, for example, traditionally is. Then we know that with a higher GDP per capita in densely populated countries, you also have a shift in political power and political influence. Are we prepared for that? And then third, it is the ecological climate disruption that I have mentioned, and it is the biggest of them all. For more than 200 years, fossil fuels were not only keeping the machines turning, the steamers and others, the cars, the airplanes, the trains, but they were also keeping our economies growing. When you read books published by historians specialized in history of history, then you will realize that the world economy has very modestly and very slowly grown from the end of the Stone Age until the end of the 18th century. And then with the invention of the steam machine, with the discovery of coal as a fossil fuel that was available in endless amounts and at very cheap prices, everything changed. Individual and public welfare were invented when we had access to unlimited resources of fossil fuels and energies to build our economies, to build our educational systems, our social security systems, our transport infrastructure, and everything else. So the challenge when talking climate protection and energy transition is not just to keep the machines turning. The challenge is keeping the machines turning and preserving the standard of living and the welfare of the people in our countries, publicly and privately. And ladies and gentlemen, some of the climate activists in my country blamed me for being not aware of the urgency of the transformation and said, we have to reduce our welfare, whatever it will cost, whatever it will mean, and if we have to become more modest, we should become more modest. And I said, yes, would be perhaps not the worst thing for me. I'm as big as I look. Yes, and would be better for my health in the next couple of years. But, ladies and gentlemen, if we in Canada, in Europe, in Germany, would achieve our climate targets just by losing jobs, millions of jobs, just by losing standard of living, social protection, and quality of medical coverage, then, ladies and gentlemen, nobody in the world, and certainly not in the emerging countries in Asia and Latin America, would buy this model from us to implement it there. And if we want to save the planet and the climate of the planet, then we have to find solutions that are implemented around the globe, or not just in a couple of countries like ours, and therefore we have to find solutions that will help us to overcome. And therefore, very briefly, the paradoxon in the challenge today is that even if we expand the capacities of renewable energies in an unprecedented way, we still will need classical, traditional energies like oil and gas and nuclear. Even if we accelerate it even more, we will reach peak gas and peak oil sooner, but we will need much more oil because we will phase out of fossil coal. Fossil coal is not flexible enough to be combined with renewable energies, and this is the big challenge of all people concerned. And the war of Russia against Ukraine is unhuman. There's a criminal war that was started against innocent people, and this has cost not millions, but tens of thousands of lives in the meantime. All this has aggravated the situation, but the challenge as such is unchanged. We have to realize that energy transition is not as simple as some people would like to argue. It is highly technological. It has economic and political implications, and it is an issue that requires much more political attention that we have paid so far. The first and the most important challenge for all of us is to overcome ideological conflicts. This is true for both sides of the table, by the way. You have in Canada exactly the same debates as we have in Germany. The one side, people in favor of climate protection, and they say it has to be done faster and without taking account of the interest of the traditional suppliers. And the others say, oh, this debate about climate change, it is the wrong debate we are organizing. Let's put it aside. No, we can solve it together, or we will not solve it at all. And therefore, I think we have to ask the question, not in an ideological way, what we are ready to accept, but what will work. What will supply us with sufficient amounts of energy at affordable prices in a sustainable way? That is the challenge. And today I see and I complain a lack of cooperation between the states involved and the signature states of the Paris Climate Agreement. They all have signed to the agreement, but there is no binding mechanism for monitoring and control. And there is no common strategy on how to achieve it. And I see a lack of reliable, long-term framework condition, where every private investor would know and would see what kind of transformation we are heading to and what kind of opportunities this will offer. I'm against the idea of some to say, let's do energy transition by state companies, by state agencies. I'm a firm believer in market economy, and I think it will be cheaper, it will be better, it will be more reliable if the private sector is involved. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we have to discuss further the question, what countries can play what role in this process? Some countries are leading with technological expertise. Germany, for example, is producing electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen. We are exporting them around the globe. Other countries have sufficient territory, sufficient natural resources in order to export energy. Germany is an energy exporting country. For many, many years already, 77% of our primary energy demand is exported from other countries. It is nuclear, it is oil, it is gas, and it is hard coal. And therefore, we have to see whether we can have certain projects done by certain countries, whether we can have reliable relationship, and when it comes to the matter, where does our gas come from? Does it come from Russia? No more. Will it come from other parts in the world? Yes, that depends. Not on Germany, it depends on the countries concerned. Are you interested in developing new business cases? Do you think this can be in the interest of your own country? It can help you not only safeguarding jobs, but also creating new jobs. Do you think you can, by exporting LNG gas, for example, contribute to more climate protection and to better transition? Because as I mentioned, as more renewable energies we will expand, as more gas we will need to substitute coal. And given the fact that the Russian gas is now lacking from the world market for many, many years, certainly, the question is, where will it come from? And this has, as a consequence, an enhanced role for LNG gas, as you, Mr. CEO, has so rightfully mentioned. I believe, finally, ladies and gentlemen, that we must take the energy sector more seriously than we have done before. Climate action and energy production are two sides of the same medal. We should tell the climate sector that we are serious about our climate targets. What has been enshrined in the Paris Climate Agreement, we will try to implement. But the climate sector has also to understand that the energy sector is not a dirty sector and is not a sector that will counteract climate protection, but it is needed as a principal actor in the transformation process. And we need, last but not least, a stronger transatlantic cooperation. When Russia attacked Ukraine, we all have seen that the Western countries, the member countries of NATO, are a community of values, based on values, democracy, human rights, decent ways of living for every citizen in the country. And this is under attack. It is under attack not only by Russia, it is under attack by many worldwide. And I believe, whether it is climate change, whether it is lasting peace, whether it is personal security and safety, we can achieve it, but we will have to achieve it together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Minister Altmaier, for very insightful words. I asked him if he could take, it's red leather on purpose, the hot seat, because we're going to invite a couple more guests to help through the next part of this, this event. And I'll just introduce him and then ask him to come up. First, we have Mac van Wielingen, who I'm sure everybody in this room knows is an energy CEO, founder of ARC Resources and ARC Financial, and a great industry leader, and frankly, just the smartest person I know, so really happy to have Mac. And then a real, true rising star, brilliant person, associate professor in both our law faculty and the Haskayne School of Business, Kristen van Biezenbos. So Kristen and Mac, if you could please join us up on stage, and we'll go to the next stage. Please welcome them.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. It's really my honor to be moderating this talk with Mac and with Peter. So I think Peter touched on many of the issues that we're going to be diving into a little bit more deeply in the conversation this afternoon. He mentioned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That, coupled with the pandemic, put to the test many of the climate commitments and energy, sort of the assumptions about the energy transition in the EU and North America as well. And so it has taken certain assumptions about who would be supplying energy to who and what types of energy would be going forward the most important for the electricity and transportation sectors, and sort of turn some of those assumptions on their heads. So let's talk a little bit about those things. I wanted to open it up by saying, since we had just heard from Peter with that really wonderful and insightful speech, I wanted to ask Mac, actually, if you can tell the audience here a little bit about what role Canada plays in Europe's energy markets now, as of now.
Firstly, if I may say that I really do think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed the world. It's changed the way we trade, the way products are moving around. It's changed the way we look at risk in our supply chains, and it's profound what's happening. And but that does lead to what Canada's role is, and I think Canada is the great opportunity for Canada, and I know the people in this room would appreciate it, is that we can be one of, if not the most reliable, responsible energy resource suppliers in the world. I mean, that is our opportunity. That is the role we can play. And to a certain extent, we are there now, but I know there's a lot of us who feel that we can do a lot more. And we're looking to do more. And it was, quite frankly, it was quite disappointing for many of us when your chancellor came here looking for LNG, and he didn't go home empty-handed. He got some hydrogen, green hydrogen down the road offered, but we did not have the capacity and the facilities in place to be able to say, yes, we can deliver LNG to Europe. And it was a hotly debated issue here. Peter, you probably picked up on it as well. And it was a real sensitivity for a lot of Canadians.
Thank you, Mac. And Peter, can you give us a sense of, so now that Mac has said a little bit about the role that Canada does and could play in European energy markets, with respect to the European energy market, what is happening now? We hear a lot about the energy crisis or looming energy crisis in the EU, and including Germany. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the crisis is and how we arrived here?
Oh, it is perhaps not a crisis, but it is a deep-going change. We had imported, I think, 55% of the gas demand in our country and most of the European countries from Russia, because it was gas through pipelines that was cheaper, it was environmentally friendly, and there was a big preference by the private sector for the Russian gas. The German gas production collapsed because, for a reason of environment protection and protection of people in the regions, there was a growing resistance against the use of shale gas in Germany. We have enormous reserves of that, and against the use of natural gas reserves as well. We have closed down all our coal mines already 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and Germany has decided switching off the nuclear power plants. They have been worth 1/3 of our electricity production 10 years ago, and now the remaining 3 we still have, and the government is going to shut down within a couple of months just 6%. And all this has to be substituted. And when you have no more nuclear, when you know that you have to phase out from coal because coal is not flexible enough to support the growing amount of renewables, then you need more gas. And now Russia has stopped providing us with gas. We are not for blackmail. And our gas supply was safe all the years. It is still safe. But we are, of course, looking for new suppliers, because 1/3 of the, approximately, of the world production in gas came from Russia. And this is now not available anymore on the world market. It will take at least 3 years before Russia has the ships required for LNG, and before Russia has built new pipelines to Asian countries, And in these years, we have a competition for gas, for reliable gas supply. And I'm not interfering with your debate on that. That is your decision, as every country will take its own decision in its own responsibility. But I can tell you that people in Germany have a big confidence in Canada, and I'm convinced that energy that is produced, even fossil energy that is produced in Canada, is in a more environmentally friendly way produced than in most other countries around the world. That is something you have to wait always when you take a decision. And the last point is that I see Canada not only as a potential exporter of classical energies. You have oil sands, you have the gas, enormous amounts of gas, but you have also all opportunities to produce hydrogen. Hydrogen will become an important player on the markets. In Australia, investors are investing billions of dollars in order to have production sites for green hydrogen. Will not be ready, I agree with Mac again, will not be ready within the next 2-3 years, but in the 2030s, enormous amounts will be produced in order to allow a climate-friendly energy policy. And therefore, countries like Saudi Arabia, like Australia, like Canada, and one day perhaps Ukraine, big countries with all the natural conditions you need, will find new business models in this as well.
Thank you, Peter. I wanted to ask you just a quick follow-up on the question of Canadian LNG, Mac. In the past, Canada has not been an exporter of LNG. We mostly sent compressed gas via pipeline to the United States. So we currently have a terminal under construction at Kitimat in British Columbia, and the Coastal GasLink pipeline should be finished, I think, sometime in the next 2 years, 3 years, maybe? It's difficult to say with Canadian pipelines. But how do you see, in the past, the Canadian government's position on expanding our LNG industry was that there wasn't really an economic case for it. Do you think that there is an economic case now for trying to expand LNG to an East Coast terminal?
Well, certainly when you look at it at a very high level, when you look at the price of natural gas in Europe, for example, or in Asia, and then you look at our cost structure and you look at the abundance of our resource and our ESG performance, it's hard to look at all that and then say, well, there's no business case. And so I think what's getting confused is when people say there's no business case, there really is no case where we can satisfy regulatory process and reduce uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, and political uncertainty sufficiently that private investors and private capital can come forward. And so that's been part of the problem, and that, of course, is what a lot of investors have expressed concern about. It's the regulatory uncertainty. You mentioned Coastal Gas Line and all the complexities there that have been very discouraging for project proponents. That is what is creating a lot of Canada's issues. And Peter, I know that permitting in Europe is a huge issue, and the permitting of wind. It's not just oil or gas; it's the permitting of building anything in the United States, in Canada, and in Europe. But LNG is technically, economically, fundamentally, from Canada, is an extraordinary opportunity. And quite frankly, to speak bluntly, we've kind of been left at the starting gate compared to the United States and how the United States has been able to execute the opportunity.
So, Peter, you mentioned Germany's interest in potentially using hydrogen. Could you tell us a little bit more about how Germany foresees hydrogen playing a role? Is it primarily something they see working in the electricity sector?
Yes. Hydrogen will play a role, first of all, in substituting gas-fired power plants. All the new gas-fired power plants we are building in the next couple of years, and we will have to build a lot of them, will be hydrogen ready. It means you can use hydrogen as soon as possible, and there are different types of hydrogen. For example, there is so-called blue hydrogen. This is not produced from renewable energies. It is produced from with normal fossil energies from fossil natural gas. And then you could do it in a climate neutral way if you would apply CCS technologies, that is carbon capture and storage, and you could organize a carbon CO2 storage in empty gas holes under the sea or in certain territories. And that would be ready within a relatively short period of time. When it comes to the production of renewable green hydrogen from renewable energies, wind and solar, then you need enormous amounts of electrolyzers. They are produced in Japan, they are produced in Germany, some other countries worldwide. For example, when I discussed the matter with Saudi Arabia, I told them, I said, well, you have the biggest desert in the world. And you could afford hundreds of kilometers of electrolyzers to produce it. When I'm talking to you people, then I would say you have enough water, because you need water, because water will be split in hydrogen and oxygen. And then you have a climate neutral way, not only for producing electricity, but also for producing chemical products, for solving heat problems, for solving problems in the transport sector. We have today in Germany hydrogen trains in very lonely regions where it would be too costly to build electricity grids, and therefore they are driven by hydrogen already today. And this is a technology that will emerge and where many, many companies will find a new business case. But of course, you need, if you want to invest as business people, you need security. You need clear perspectives. And therefore, my suggestion would be, whenever you talk to people in Europe or to people in the US or elsewhere, please ask for treaties that are not short-term, but medium and long-term. And then you know that your investment will come back in due time, and you know what to do. We can produce also hydrogen from nuclear power plants. The only problem is, I was never a grassroots activist against nuclear energy, never in my life. But I see that the process of building new nuclear power plants has become so slow that it would take 20 years before it would make a real difference.
And Mac, here in Alberta, the oil and gas industry produces a large amount of hydrogen already, although it would be mostly classified as gray hydrogen or potentially blue hydrogen. Do you get the sense that there's any potential here in Alberta to take place in a green hydrogen boom, something that Ottawa has been talking about?
I think so, but I think it's longer term. It's the economics are so compelling to use natural gas, and then, as Peter said, combine that with carbon capture and sequestration. We have the reservoirs, we have the pore space here, we have the natural gas. And so to make blue hydrogen would be so much more logical for Alberta. And also then it creates the opportunity to build a market. Because that's one of the great challenges, is that we really don't have a large hydrogen market. And so it gives you the opportunity to build infrastructure, and you can phase these kinds of new energy products in over time. And I think that's the way we need to think, is we need to think more in terms of time frames, contingencies, where different systems and different technologies and substitutes for traditional hydrocarbons get phased in, and there's some overlap and there's some optionality. Like, Peter, regarding nuclear, I'd be interested in just asking, if I could, about small-scale modern nuclear. I mean, because that's really caught a lot of people's attention, including here in Alberta. Small-scale nuclear for our oil sands, because they have such a need for electricity. And the thinking is, because they're small, they're modular, that those time frames you reference and the cost overruns we're all familiar with, that we could do a much better job with that new technology, modern technology.
Yeah, I think we have to discuss all these issues at their own merit and then find solutions. And of course, when we would have asked the traditional producers of sail ships whether they agree with the introduction of steamers, They would have said no. We have the infrastructure and we want to keep it. But if they would have said from one day to the other, all sail ships are forbidden by law and only steamers are allowed, the global trade would have collapsed immediately. So what we have to know is we still have about 25 years until 2050. And we have to discuss what we can achieve and how we will achieve it. That is important. You have to have a plan. And this plan has to be developed in close cooperation between the private sector and the public sector, the political sector. For example, our steel industry. The steel industry works traditionally with coal. In order to produce the steel, you need enormous amounts of coal. And this is very polluting and very bad for the climate. So we have discussed with them that we could produce green steel. For green steel, they need green hydrogen. But this is not available in the enormous amounts that they would need. Therefore, in the first step, there is a transformation from coal to gas. And you can make the steel with gas. And that means what I told you before, a higher demand for gas imports to Germany. And then in the second stage, you will substitute first small proportions, then bigger proportions, finally everything by green hydrogen. This is a process over 2.5 decades. And this has to be seen and has to be realized. And then everybody can calculate what kind of investment is still promising and what kind of investment is not. And what you have mentioned with regard to Ukraine is something that is important. Because we have so many ideological barriers, the options we have are limited. For example, in Germany, I'm not criticizing that. 80% of my compatriots were against nuclear energy after the Fukushima incident. But in Germany, we have decided switching off all nuclear power plants. And that means that we have now, with the shortage of gas from Russia, we have to rely more and more on coal-fired power plants. And even where we have bought in auctions the gas in Asia, because we can pay more at the spot markets than Thailand or Bangladesh or can pay for it, Cambodia can pay for it, even they will rely more on old-fashioned coal than they have done in the past. So one event, the war of Russia against Ukraine, has as a consequence many other implications. And as politicians, we have to discuss it. And every implication offers a risk, but every implication offers also new chances for new actors. And this is what I would encourage you to do, to think about the chances you see in the present situation, and then talk to your French, British, German, American counterparts how we can find a solution that is in the mutual interest.
And here's a question that I think I'm going to pose first to Mac and then to Peter. So the title of this talk is Energy versus Climate. So certainly since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, there's been this sense that when Russia became an unreliable provider of gas and oil to Europe, I think it called into question some of the decisions, potentially by some parties, some of the decisions that some countries in the EU had made about no longer being self-sufficient or self-supplying.
Yeah. No, sorry. The last point, can you please repeat it? The last couple of words.
Oh, just, I guess the question was just, do you feel like the conversation in Germany and Europe over the pace of trying to transition away from fossil fuels has been impacted by the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, we discussed it over lunch, Mac and me,
and we had a very friendly lunch.
I have spent all my life in supporting climate change, but always with the question, will it work? And when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, the question was, what is the target? We shall become climate neutral by 2050 at the latest, yes, but then it was but preserving a global warming below 1.5 degree. And this was not very clear. It is not clear. because the ambition is very difficult to be met in practice. And the point is, are we ready to pay the price for that? Or would it mean that the Western economies would become weaker and would lose market shares worldwide? This is something we have to discuss, and the same is true for the war of Russia against Ukraine. We will see next year the emission figures for this year. And I've no doubt CO2 emissions, after many years of decline, will be in the rise again. And this will continue the year after next year, and in 3 years' time, again, despite the fact that we are all committed to more renewable energy installations in our countries. And then the question is, what does it mean? It is not my role to advise the new government. This was not the government I have campaigned for in the election campaign, but it's a matter of a question of political culture, that I'm not advising my own government from abroad what to do, but every government has to discuss the necessary consequences. And in my government, and this I can say because it is not an advice, there is a big conflict these days, yesterday, for example, on how long the remaining 3 nuclear power plants shall run, until April, as wants the Green coalition partner, or 4 years longer, as wants the Liberal coalition partner. I cannot from Calgary interfere. That would make Calgary and me very prominent in Germany. But it is not my intention. I'm just explaining that this kind of debate is a normal debate, and it is badly needed. And it has to be based on facts and not on ideology, as I told you. And therefore, there are so many experts, not only business people, but experts in energy policy. Please make a fact check every time somebody comes with a proposal and says this is the solution for this and that problem. You cannot, for example, in Germany, we have lots of industry. 20% of our GDP production depends on industry. That is the biggest share in Europe of any industrialized country. And this cannot be solved in a purely decentralized way by small producers. A company like BASF is consuming 1% of the entire German energy production. That is an enormous lot, and it is done in winter, in summer, in spring, and in fall. So you have, in order to provide safety and reliability of supply, you have to know where your energy comes from. And of course, from an environmental point of view, you have to know how much damage is done. One argument in favor of the Russian gas, by the way, has always been that it was more environmentally preferable, for one simple reason: LNG has to be cooled down, and then you lose 25 to 30% of the energy, and then you have more CO2 emissions at the end. But nowadays we know that the pipeline gas from Russia will not be available for a foreseeable time in the future, and that means that LNG for Europe and for Germany becomes, or has become, a very realistic perspective.
Well, it's very, very complicated, and I think everybody can appreciate it. And when you're talking about Russia, for example, and Russian gas, Russia is one of the worst emitters of methane in the world from their natural gas streams. Yeah. And we all know that methane is one of the worst and most toxic pollutants. And so you might have to be saving there on the LNG side, but there's an enormous amount of complexity. But Peter, if I could get back to the nuclear argument, and because I know a lot of people are really struggling with Germany's decision to phase out nuclear in the shorter time frame that you mentioned, for example, 4 months or so. and as compared to the 4 years. And I hear a lot of debate about it, and people really are sincere in trying to understand the logic of it in the middle of an energy crisis right now, and the implications to the rest of Europe, and the implications even into developing countries who are trying to buy LNG and having to compete with Germany to buy LNG, not just Germany, but Europe. And so can you help us understand that logic specific to the phase out of nuclear?
Well, it is perhaps less a logic than ideology, from both sides, by the way. When Germany decided first, under a red-green coalition government in 1999, switching down all nuclear power plants, we were reforming European treaties. And then France was afraid that we would request France doing the same and phasing out of nuclear energy. And the red-green coalition government was afraid that France would insist on the reopening of our nuclear power plants. And as a compromise, we inserted in the European treaties that the energy mix is decided by every country in its own responsibility. So we had an integrated internal market for energy, but an autonomous national decision on the energy mix. That means gas, coal, nuclear, and renewables. Now, one argument of the green side, if I may so, that is, of course, in a certain way realistic, is that you cannot switch on and switch off power plants, nuclear power plants, every few years. 10 years ago, 80% of the people in Germany were against. Now 80% are in favor. Public opinion is switching much more easily than power plants can be built or rebuilt or shut down. The second point is that I believe we should discuss as a big energy exporting country. Germany has fueled the energy demand for many countries in the region. We have imported 77% of our primary energy demand, but we have exported a third of our electricity to the neighboring countries as well. Everything is so incredibly interconnected, and therefore we have to discuss it with our neighbors. But nevertheless, we are speaking about 6% of the electricity supply in my country that can be important, and therefore I'm not saying shut them down. I cannot say without causing trouble keep them running. That has to be discussed, but if friends of us in Canada and the US, in Europe, will contribute to that decision and to that debate, please feel invited and call the members of our government and tell them what you think would be the best solution. Finland needed years to build a new nuclear power plant. France, more than 15 years already.
Yeah.
And that is the problem with this technology. Therefore, I believe wherever we have it, in Canada, in the US, elsewhere, it will remain to play a major role because nuclear electricity is almost climate neutral. That is an important message. However, the issue, how many will be built in the future, is something that exceeds my technological skills as a bloody poor lawyer, whom I am, and the promise that we could have very cheap, very reliable, very safe, very small producers of nuclear energy is very old. I know it. There are some new ideas and some new models, and the American government is excited by that. So if that works, fine. It will change the world again. But I believe it when I see it. This is when I say we have to take decisions based on facts. And you need at least a prototype running elsewhere in the world, and then you can say whether it works or not.
I really appreciate that. I can see a very strong practical side in you. You know, you want to do things, as you said earlier, you want to do things that work, and which is an appropriate counterbalance to just being ideological and not necessarily being logical. But I still I'm still not satisfied about the 4 months versus 4 years problem for phasing out nuclear. You know, well, when you say that, you know,
I understand you better without Mike.
you do? When you say when you say that Germany may be phasing out nuclear in the very short time frame,
according to the law, yes.
According to the law, given what's going on in Europe and the war, to me it almost looks like force majeure. I mean, you need power, and so it's really hard to comprehend the kind of the decision making behind it.
No, it is of course without the Green Party in government, we would have perhaps a different discussion and debate in Germany. This I do not say in order to criticize. I say it in order to explain to you. Mr. Obama, for many years, was not able to sign a climate agreement because he had no majority in Congress. And that was why the Copenhagen Climate COP was a big failure. If we would have come to terms in Copenhagen, the transition would have been much easier, and also for most of you in the room, and you would have had more reliability, more clarity, more transparency, and then it took almost 6 or 7 years until we achieved the Paris Climate Agreement. And that is what I explained. And the second thing is, we have switched off already so many over the last years. The first one, the first 7 in 2011, then the next one in 2015. Last year we have switched off, I think, 5 or 6, and 3 of them could be brought to working again. This is heavily debated, but the fact that I make a comment on that will probably not make it easier, but perhaps more difficult to achieve a solution. That is something a politician has always to have in mind.
I apologize for that.
So let me actually take a moment to open up the floor to see if there are any questions from any of the guests that we have here today. Or I can let Mac and Peter just recreate their lunch conversations for all of you, because they are fascinating. I got to hear them already, but I would not mind hearing them again. But are there any questions? I think we have a microphone moving around the room too.
Just while we're waiting, Peter, you and I talked about the mindset of NIMBYism.
Yeah.
And not in yard.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be very interesting for all of us here to hear a bit of perspective on that problem, because it's a problem that it's common to everywhere you are in the world, and in Canada and in the United States. But it almost looks like the NIMBYism is not just local, it almost looks like it's country specific. In other words, I'm prepared to import something that is dirty and not doable in our own country from you, and I'll use it, but I don't want it within sight, and I don't want it on my books.
Well, that is certainly true. NIMBYism is also according to countries. For example, when I come back to Germany, when I was still in office, there was enormous opposition by the Green Party against the idea of importing LNG gas. I had tabled a proposal to build 2 terminals in the north of Germany to export American shale gas as LNG gas. And we have spent a lot of money for that. We have changed the law, everything. And there was enormous resistance because it was seen as unhealthy and as damaging. When I made a proposal to produce shale gas in Germany, there was a cross-party consensus that was a silly idea of mine, because it would affect the properties and the homes and the gardens of the people. That was NIMBYism on local level. And now and that is what you mentioned, people under the impression of the crisis say, no, not in my backyard, still not. This type of NIMBYism is still intact. But they say at least, oh, when LNG comes from United Arab Emirates, from Qatar, from the US, from Canada, then perhaps we could live with that, at least when we can take warm showers all the time. But certainly not in my backyard, and certainly not in Germany. This is a debate we have to consider in Germany in a more profound way in the months and years to come, because I believe that what we think is responsible and acceptable in other countries should be, under similar conditions, acceptable in our country as well.
Right, and that's the point.
I think we do actually have an audience question over here.
Just building on this excellent conversation, thank you, Peter and Mac. It strikes me that energy is foundational to our quality of life, yet democratic.
Can you come a little bit closer to
Sure.
me? Otherwise, I don't understand it. It's
Come on up
acoustic.
here on the stage, Judy. Just joking.
So
And-
energy
yeah.
is so fundamental to our quality of life.
Yeah.
Yet democratic countries and their ideologies have been standing in the way of facts. How do we solve that problem? And given that it's the long time frames to put energy systems in place and political cycles, democratic political cycles, how do we solve that globally in democratic countries?
Well, you asked the right
Well,
question for this gentleman.
Your complaint is a complaint from both sides. You say, à juste titre, comme le disent les Français, that all these necessary decisions are not possible because of ideological arguments. The climate movement in Germany says, well, we should have achieved climate neutrality much sooner, but it was not possible because of the democratic requirements according to our constitution. And I must say, as somebody who wanted to be a historian when I was young, and I was interested in the democratic idea from the ancient Greeks till today, I must say nothing will become better if we reduce democracy or abolish it entirely. And when you look at authoritarian countries, nothing is better and much is worse. That is my answer to that. What I can recommend is that more than in the past, the branches of industry and business will have to provide the necessary information, but not in a way that you are campaigning, that you are telling things that are not true at the end, but in a way that people can understand. And the younger generation in my country is more open to arguments than we might have thought in the past. I'm now, as a pensioner, I'm now invited by universities, by students, etc., to discuss things, and they are open in a very impressive and encouraging way.
Very helpful.
Well, it looks like we're actually out of time. That's always the problem with these kinds of events. They tell us we have 40 minutes, and the only thing I can think of that is just not enough time. Maybe it's different having to listen to it, but just being up here, I thought, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much to both Mac and Peter,
thank you.
and thank you to all of you for attending the talk as well.
Thanks, Kristen.
Well, I know everyone could listen to much more of this, but we do have our days. I want to give out some thank yous. I want to start by thanking PETRONAS Canada, and in particular Iswan, the CEO, and Shannon Young, Vice President of Sustainability and External Relations, is here as well. Thank you so much for giving all of us this opportunity to hear from an international statesman. Of course, thank you very much, Minister Altmaier, and to the whole panel. Kristen and Mac, and I thought that was really a stirring conversation. Enjoyed it quite a bit. Thank you to our Haskane team. It takes a lot of work to put something like this together. So Jessica and Lasha and Elizabeth and Olivia, thank you so much for all the work you put into this. Thanks so much to the TELUS Convention Center and Marriott catering staff. We kind of take it for granted, but it's pretty hard to be doing all this delivery of meals while everybody's glued on the stage. And I thought they did a marvelous job. Thank you so much for that. Now, please take home. You have some gifts from PETRONAS on each table, sustainable soap and honey, and don't get them mixed up. And please look on the screen for instructions on how to provide feedback for today's program. Your feedback will help us plan future events. We will also be sending out a feedback survey, and we'd really love if you could follow up on that. Thank you all so much for your support of the Haskane School of Business, Calgary's Business School, and for being a part of this really interesting afternoon. Have a great day. Thank you all.